Good evening. I will turn my mic off. I'd like to welcome you to the Committee of the Whole for West Jordan City Council. We have Council Member Jacob, Council Member Worthen, Council Member Green is joining us via Zoom, Council Member Whitelock, Council Member Bloom, Council Member Pack, and Council Member McConaughey, as well as staff. The first item on our agenda is discussion amending the West Jordan 2009 Code, sections 13.7C 1 through 13.7C 9 and sections 13.7D 1 to 13.7D 9 and section 13.17 2, general plan amendments and zoning ordinances. Is this, Alan, is this you?
Yes, it is.
Scott?
Thank you.
Okay.
So over the past, probably since October, there was an applicant that pulled their public hearing after the noticing had already gone out. A majority of you had indicated that you would like some changes to that. I worked with Duncan Murray, who is here. He's the code expert on land use. And in the request for council action, it basically addresses 7 topics. So the first topic, with the change in form of government and some changing of department names by the administration. All the references to the former name has now been corrected to community development. It defines the public hearing process for both the Planning Commission and City Council, and that, in summary, is basically once the notices have been sent out to the public as a benefit to the public, that the applicant would not be able to withdraw their public hearing or request that their item be pulled from the agenda. The other thing, third bullet that it does is it prohibits incomplete applications. A majority of the council has expressed a concern that there's things such as rezones and future land use map amendments that would require the city to change its infrastructure. In talking with Mr. Murray, he indicated that we were the one-off. We do it differently than most other cities that do require complete applications. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. What this will do is this will help the city in general know when a development is coming in, what they're proposing to put in, so that the city can follow also in code its adequate public facilities, that there's adequate water, sewer, delivery systems, those type of things. The third one is it expands the application analysis instead of just through community development, that it's any affected department. So when an application comes in, it does allow for an analysis by public utilities, by public works, by fire, by police. All of those different departments in the city can make an analysis of a project, whether it's 11 acres or 600 acres or 1,000 acres. The other one is you received an email from Mr. Rob Wall, our city attorney, about changes to LUDMA as it relates to findings and changing that to criteria and determinations in the code. And then I asked Mr. Murray to just make sure we're consistent in the wording. So every time that we use the word future land use map, we say that consistently throughout this section of code. Also general map amendments, those are consistent. And then just some clarity in the submittal requirements section where we use consistent sublets to identify those. And that's in essence what this code is. I do have it, I can show you if you have questions specific about the code. I did take it to the Planning Commission initially back in November, presented it to the Planning Commission. They forwarded a favorable recommendation. I will speak, I think, for Scott. That his department is appreciative and desires to see this code, and now I'm bringing it to the council to see if there's any changes or refinement that you would like to make in addition to what's already being proposed.
Okay. I do have some. Does anyone else have anything? Okay, I'm not seeing lights, so I'm going to go with mine. Line 44 and 46. We've talked about having projects such as Welby West, or as we did with what turned out to be Woods Ranch, come before a committee of the whole prior to them paying a fee to see if we even have any appetite for what they're thinking about. Do we want to add something there? It's really a question for the body, so does anyone have any input?
I think we need to, Kayleen.
Voice from above.
No, I think that's wise.
Okay, so I have 4. So let's add something to that.
What lines are those again? 44,
Well,
45?
I would add it probably before 44. I'd add it between 43 and 44 because, or let's see, no, after 45 probably, because 46 is the applicant shall submit the application together with the applicable fee according to. So just somewhere right in there, I feel the opportunity should be presented. It's certainly an opportunity, not they have their free will. Mr. Lee, do you have something?
I do. Do you? How far do you extend that privilege? In other words, theoretically, 1-acre parcels. Do you want to extend that privilege to? Do you want to limit it to 5 acres, 10 acres, and up? Do you have thoughts on that, council? Just looking for clarity on how much you want to offer that up, because you may have many try to take advantage of that before paying the fee and starting the process.
Well, I don't think many 1 acres are asking for exceptions to the code. I think they start it closer to the 10 acre. Mr. Langsford, do you have some insight? I would love if we were at a table and we could all just sit together.
Someday, right? Just not really a question, more of a clarification. So this would be any future land use map amendment would come to committee of the whole first.
Just when you're looking at a project like Welby West or Woods or Jones, any of those that they're looking at kind of major things, right? We have a land use already there. They want something quite a bit different and they want some exceptions. It would be nice if before we used a whole year of our time, they could have an idea that maybe there isn't 4 or more that are even willing to entertain that idea.
Yeah, Mr. Anderson and I have talked about that concept and whether it's baked into this code amendment or through your council rules and procedures.
I want it in the code.
We can. Great.
I want it in the code because the code is what we follow, and a developer isn't going to read council rules, but they might peruse our code.
We would welcome that, actually. That would help staff a lot. But Mr. Lee is correct. If we have the opportunity to work together to wordsmith it and put it in the right place, I think generally I understand the desire of the council, and it certainly would work out. That's what we expected. We just didn't expect it here in the code. We expected it in a different place, but the end result would be the same.
Okay. Councilmember Jacob has something.
Yeah, with the committees, this is what the committees are supposed to do, right? The land use committee is not supposed to be a required step. It's supposed to be an optional step, so that if a developer has something that they want to get council feedback on, there's 3 council members ready, willing, and able. We'll put you on the agenda. We'll do it. So that was the idea of this committee, is not to exclude council members, but just to make it easier for a developer to get in front of some council members and say, this is what I'm thinking. What feedback do you have? And then if you give them, if the land use committee says, this is awful, this is horrible, this is terrible, it's obviously not a binding decision. If they choose to keep going down that road, that's their money that they're spending. That's what they're doing. And
Right.
if they get to a place where
Let-
It was very helpful with Woods Ranch to have a meeting of committee of the whole.
Yeah.
They came in with their overarching idea, and we said, well, your roads have got to be good. This has got to be there. This has got to be there. And they heard from 4 or 5 of the council members.
they were also proposing like a whole new section of code, a whole new zone,
You're right.
that wasn't.
They
just
were
a
asking for a
regional-
lot of exemptions, just like this one. So I would entertain asking staff to look at what they feel is right. Councilmember McConaughey.
Thank you, Chair. Kind of similar to Councilmember Jacob, if they're asking for, I'm not so worried about the exceptions, but where they're asking for rewrites to code and modifications to code to accommodate them so they can be compliant, that's where I kind of, like, as Chair Whitelock mentioned, want to hear from staff ideas of what threshold may be. I know the application fee doesn't really cover all the work that staff ends up putting into things. So I don't know if perhaps you can look at this and say, wow, this is going to take us anywhere from 150 to 1,200 hours, man hours, just to get stuff prepared. And we don't know if the council wants that. If maybe there's like an hour of staff time threshold that you could set. I want to make it as easy as possible for developers to get in front of the council, but at the same time, I don't want people just coming, hey, I don't want to pay the bill for an exception, but here's why I think you should make an exception for me because this, that, or the other thing. Like, well, no, there's a process and you can pay the fee and go that route if you're just looking for an exception. But if there's something significant that's going to be required of staff or the council, I'd like to get it before we spend too much staff time. In my mind, the idea here is not so much to bend over backwards for the bigger developers and ignore the smaller ones. Rather, it's to safeguard taxpayer funds when the taxpayers are footing the bill for our employees. If we're going to have an excessive amount of employee staff time that's going to be utilized and those fees don't cover that and they're questioning whether or not they're going to pay those fees, that's where I would look to you and say, well, do you think this would be reasonable, an hour of committee of the whole versus 80 hours of prep work from you guys, just have it thrown out?
Can I jump in here?
Green.
Yeah, here's a couple of thoughts. The land use committee has provided feedback to developers, and over the last several months, those recommendations have gone unheeded, and I'm going to say by staff and by the developers. And they do what they want to do, and then they come to the council because, oh, 3's not good enough. I still have 4 other people that I can convince that my project is a good idea. And so, Zach, you're right. Part of the purpose of having the land use committee was to do that, but it's not been functioning. Welby West, the land use committee told them there were some very specific things that ought to work, and it got ignored. That because everybody went to PRDH, and then we fought over PRDH, and then we went to PRDM. We've got another one that we have another one going in 90th over across the street from Glover Nursery. The land use committee said, no, we don't like that idea. And yet the developer decided they were going to do it that way, and it's going to be presented to us that way. And so the feedback from the land use committee has been, I'm gonna say recently the feedback for the land use committee has been marginal at best. I think that the better process, and I think Scott may be right, it may not be in this section, but the better process would be that, and I'll give you another example. I know there's a developer right now that wants to build on the west side. He's asking that the ordinance allows for a specific exception, and the developer wants that and wants to get in front of the council, so that the developer's not wasting a lot of time. The land use committee twice thought it was a good idea, but is it good because it's going to be an exception under the integrated housing ordinance? Is that something that the council wants to entertain? And so I really do think that if it's a future if it's exceptions to policy, a future land use amendment, a zoning change, anything that's got, like I said, exceptions, I think it needs to come to the council first. The council provides the feedback, and then at the end, the land use committee can become more of the gatekeeper to say, council provided all of this feedback. Did you meet that? And then we can make a recommendation to the whole body as it comes back to say, no, they didn't pay attention to this. Yes, they did do this. And so that's where I'm at on that one.
Okay. So do you have enough Mr. Lee, I'm just looking at you because you're their boss.
Thank you. Well, it's a little nuanced. Scott and Alan, with this feedback, will take a crack at it and bring it back.
Perfect. Then the next lines I want to go to are 90 and 91. I'd like to know why this got changed to 10 years, and then I'm going to state flat out, I'm not okay with that. Our general plan is what guides the city, and I don't like having a bunch of people coming in asking for zone changing because our general plan's out of date. So, do we know why? Who changed it 10 years? Do we know why? Anyone? I know it takes a long time, but the longer in between that we do it, the harder the work is. If we don't wait 5 and 10 years, in my mind, you could get done a lot quicker.
I think Alan was nodding his head at me, so it does say 5. That's obviously been the goal in the past. Obviously, this last round it took is 10. Obviously, this should state whatever goal that the council wants. You can put whatever number you want in. There is the downside, though, if you don't have some kind of a range and we go above the maximum, then somebody could maybe use that against us and say we didn't follow within our.
Oh, we ought to
our own
follow our
maximum.
own code. That's for sure.
Right.
We should.
So I'd say if you want to stick to the 10, then there should be a commitment moving forward. I mean, stick
No,
to
I
the
don't
5
wanna
rather.
stick
I'm
to the
sorry,
10.
I misspoke. If you wanted to stick with the 5, and then you just have to have a commitment to stick with the 5. But we'll put
Mr.
whatever
Langsford,
number in you
what's
want
your
in.
input?
I agree. I think as I read that section of code, the one of the words that stands out to me is the word comprehensive, top to bottom. An understanding of what that means would help us. I think with the council's clarification, we can look at we may not change everything top to bottom, but we should look at the various elements. As you know, excuse me, the general plan's made up of different elements or chapters. While we haven't done a comprehensive top to bottom since 2012, 2013, we have made other amendments and adjusted some of the elements, but a little more clarity on that word comprehensive would be helpful to us. And we can adjust or adapt to any time frame the council sets. We just need to know what's expected of us.
Okay, Councilmember Bloom.
Would removing comprehensive help and just prepare an update to the general plan?
Yep.
Or do we need to work on that wording so that way it kind of encompasses both updates and comprehensive?
If I may, Council Chair,
I first want to ask Mr. Wall if he has thoughts.
I did have one thought. LUDMA requires that every time there's a zone change that's inconsistent with the general plan must be updated.
Oh.
So those are going to automatically have to come before you. The idea of a comprehensive update, that's really in the council's discretion. My perspective has been in a city that's in a growth mode as fast as this city is. It's good practice for you to take an overall look at the general plan more frequently than 10 years. And as Scott said, that doesn't mean you go through it every section, but line by line, but you look at the whole thing as a whole. That's a lot different than taking an element, a couple of elements a year. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you take 6 months to do it.
So what if instead of update, it said review? What does that do legally?
I think that's fine. My concern would be if you took out the word comprehensive and just said update every 10 years or 5 years, that's not consistent with LUDMA. LUDMA requires it to be updated every time there's a zone change,
Okay.
if there's a contradiction.
So, Mr. Anderson,
I was simply going to offer a suggestion that maybe a comprehensive update to the general plan happen every 10 years, but a review happen at a period the council desires that's less than 10 years.
Mr. Langsford, do you have input?
That would sound good, and I don't want to speak for other department heads, but I know that we would love to get into a cadence where every 3 years we're updating our water master plan, which is an element of the general plan, and so it gets nuanced, and
So you want to maybe look at these lines and
we would love to
talk
look
to
at
the
these,
directors and
yes.
maybe come back with something, because
That'd be
10 years just is, I can't say yes to 10 years. That's not in a city like ours. Maybe if we were like, I don't know, anywhere in this country currently, Detroit, maybe they're not growing at all anymore. So maybe there 10 years is okay, but in a growing area, I'm not okay. Thank you. Okay, the next line is 205 and 210. And I want to know what criteria the zoning administrator will be using. How will they decide? (205 to 210).
It's, yeah,
In
209.
cases where the amendment has been withdrawn by the applicant, no application for an amendment for the same or substantially the same request, and in the case of a map amendment or the same or substantially the same property, shall be filed within 6 months from the date of withdrawal of the amendment. The determination of whether an application for an amendment is the same or substantially the same shall be made by the zoning administrator. What kind of criteria will they have to know?
See, I think that's in there because I think it's a judgment call. And that's why it says, okay, it's according to this guy's judgment. And that's it. It's a judgment call. I mean, I may be up in the night, but that's.
It is, and we could certainly add a definition to that if the council feels that would help. And the current zoning administrator is Larry Gardner, and I can tell you that he doesn't just operate in a vacuum. There's definitely consultation that occurs, but we can make any adjustments or clarifications as needed. It would not only help perhaps you, but him as well.
I just wanted an answer. Do you have something more, Councilmember Jacob?
Yeah, well, I'm just trying to keep going down that road. I think if you laid out all the like specific requirements, it's no more than 10% different number of lots, or it's no more than 3 acres, or 3% of this, or 10% of that, or whatever, to be substantially the same. Then you take the judgment out of it, and then you don't have a determination by a zoning administrator. You just have facts. You just have it is this or it is not this. And then
I like using facts better than than choice.
I just think
usually,
there's some
but
cases, and we've
there-
seen some
that-
cases recently, right, where some people say it meets the code and some people say it doesn't meet the code, and it's a judgment call in a lot of cases. There's a lot
Right.
of ambiguity.
I just know the city put out money because of a judgment call.
Well, and that's kind of a risk you have to take, but I think there's a reason for the ambiguity in some cases, because I think we're dealing with people and we're dealing with individuals at different times and different places, and this council is going to think something significantly the same, and another council is going to say, well, in my opinion, that's different. And that's why we put it on the shoulders of an appointed person and not an elected person, because that way it's a little less removed from the politics of any given thing or whatever. So anyway, that's just kind of my thinking on that. I'm fine with the way it stands, but it's just what I'm thinking.
Okay. 398 to 404.
Chair Whitelock,
Yes.
I just had a question.
Yes.
Maybe Mr. Langford can answer this. I don't know if you know off the top of your head. If the zoning administrator were to make a determination of substantial and the applicant disagreed, would that appeal go to the Board of Adjustment or the Planning Commission? Okay, that may be a reason to maybe want to put a little more parameter around this. I'm not sure a Board of Adjustment is really equipped to make this decision without some guidance, because that's not typically something that a Board of Adjustment would hear on appeal. Not that they're not capable, but they would be superimposing their will over yours and the zoning administrator, which neither he nor you would like. So maybe we ought to think about that a little bit. I don't know, it just kind of occurred to me, because I wasn't sure
Well,
how the show goes.
Okay.
Well, my question is, and I'm gonna sidetrack on your comment there, and I know that after the Woodland Hills case from on high, Mr. Langford mentioned and maybe the whole, this part of it with the land use decisions and the appeal process, I'm wondering if we shouldn't look at that. And I know Scott wants to drift more to an appeal that would be an ALJ type thing. Uh, I know Duncan and I had a discussion about ALJ, but the planning commissioner or the board of adjustment being the one that interprets the code. And so I'm wondering if, I think you're right. I think that if there's an appeal, uh, we need to look at defining some of those parameters, but I'm wondering if we shouldn't look at the entire appeal process while we're doing it.
Okay, thank you. 398 and 404, it just again discusses basically the order of where things occur. So I don't know if we're going to send things to a committee of a whole, if it also needs to appear there. Then in 436 to 438, do we really want that there? Do we want an applicant to be able to say, this is the day I want my thing on your agenda, basically? If I'm reading it, that's how I read it.
436 is for the planning commission.
Yeah, but we're in charge of doing the code. Do we really want the applicant to be able to say, I want it on their agenda on this day? And that's a question. Do you have input, Mr. Langsford? Or is there a reason we have it there, Duncan?
What this is it's, they're not picking the date. What it is there's an original date set for the public hearing, right? And if for some reason the applicant wants to change that original date that's been set, then this is the process he goes through. He has to get approval from the planning commission chair to be able to do it. He can't just of his own accord unilaterally try to change the date.
Yeah, it just, it is my opinion that when we allow public hearings to get canceled and then renoticed, we lose the trust of the public.
Right, and this is trying to limit that. Maybe
Right,
not
it limits it, but it still allows it. That's my point.
Okay. So you want
So,
to prohibit it altogether?
Well,
rather
I'm
than
just
limit it?
asking if the body wants to allow that. Do we want this in code? That's why we're reviewing code, correct?
Right. That's right.
And
Yeah,
then you're going to want me to vote on this, right? So I just want to know if the body wants this in code. So, Councilmember Bloom.
No, this was the same question I had. I had it already popped up before you got to it. It was why the applicant proposes a specific planning commission meeting. If there's a way we can reword it where it doesn't feel like they have this power of like, oh, this is going to be good for me, but I think we can word it better.
If I may interject, one of the ideas as I talked about this with Mr. Murray on these public hearings is a developer can do a couple things. They can say, I want to pull my application, date uncertain, we don't know. I think that's one aspect. The other aspect is if you really need to tweak it, you can maybe come up with a couple dates that may work, but it's still to the chair of the planning commission. It would still be to the chair of the council, which is in code, to set the agenda. So I think it still gives power, but it also, I think, helps the applicant decide if you're not willing to propose a couple dates that may be beneficial. Are you considering pulling your application? Are you withdrawing your application if you're not willing to give us a date?
Councilmember McConaughey.
Thank you. Kind of in line with what Mr. Anderson was saying, I really didn't have too much of an issue with them proposing a date because it sounds like if they're asking for it to be changed, they're going to have to propose another date. This is similar to the section lines 355 to 368. It's the same thing for city council versus the section for the planning commission. I did have a separate concern about this that I can come back to later if you want to keep going on your list.
Nope, I'm done.
Okay.
So what's your number?
You can either look at the section that's up on the screen for the planning commission, or you could go up to 355 to 368 because it's essentially the same.
Mhm.
but the two pieces that I don't really care much for, the public hearing date for the application shall not be canceled or changed except as follows. And then you've only got those two criteria. Well, what if there's a significant storm or weather issue that says we can't have city council meeting? Is there a provision for the council to decide that, even though they're not asking for the hearing date to be changed, the council can still decide we're going to change it? I don't want to take away flexibility from the council to be able to make modifications there. And then the other part
Is it different? Can I just find out, do I have I agree with Councilmember McConaughey that there should be some provision for the council or the planning commission to be able to move it if need be. Okay.
Well,
Yes. Okay, so that
So,
we
I-
have support for. It's still Councilmember McConaughey, Councilmember Green. Okay.
yeah, okay.
and similar, I wanted to make sure that there's an avenue for staff. If the applicant provided everything to us, like right in front of the deadline, we get it published, and
That
then
would
staff
never
comes back
happen.
and says, you know what, there's actually a couple red flags. They've changed things since we saw this originally. This is something new we haven't seen before. We're not ready for this. We need to have a mechanism so staff can make a recommendation to council that it get adjusted as well. Ultimately, I don't know that needs to be codified, but there needs to be a mechanism for the council to say we're going to adjust this. And that was just one of the other things that kind of came to mind. I know Scott's had a few attempted quick ones pulled on him, and I don't want to legislate ourselves into a corner.
Okay.
The other thing, even though it allows for the chair and the vice chair to agree to adjust it and pull it, I'd still like to see kind of, I'm not sure I like that, without the ability for it to happen in a public meeting. If people have come to have their voice heard, and if chair and vice chair decide on Wednesday at 4:45 that this is going to be moved and removed from the agenda, and moved to another day, I'd still want the folks who are there present to have the opportunity. So I don't know that I would want to cancel the public hearing, but I'd like for the body of the council to be able to make a decision. I mean, after the agenda's been published and it's the council's agenda, I mean, typically when we're in a meeting making changes, it requires the vote of 4 to make a modification. However, something significant like land use is suggesting that this could be done just by 2. So I'm not sure I like that idea. If there were a short time frame, I'd like some sort of assurance that this could still remain on the agenda, perhaps with a notice that it's going to be moved to a different date and people can still speak. I don't want to say no public hearing, you will not speak on this topic except during citizen comments. That was my concern with both.
I think, Councilmember McConaughey, I believe it's addressed in 360 and 361 because the goal of this is once the city has noticed the public, that the public hearing would be held, regardless of whether the applicant wanted to pull it or wanted to pick another date. 360, just in case the public hearing date for the application shall not be canceled or changed. I do see the word is kept as followed, and I think we can address that. But the impetus behind this is to give the public the opportunity to speak. The council can choose the way I was hoping this would work out. The council could choose to hold the public hearing and hear from the residents, and they could choose to delay action or table it or refer it to a later date for action as a courtesy to the applicant. But once the notices have been sent out and those costs have been incurred by the developer and the city, that the public hearing be held.
And I recognize that's the direction, but the way I read it,
Yeah.
if the chair and the vice chair were to decide 3 minutes before council meeting starts that it's going to be a different date, then they would be okay to do that. And I feel like that should be the case.
Okay.
I agree with Chris. We don't need the exception there that says applicant proposes a new date and let somebody make those changes. If the and the one thing that I semi disagree with Chris on is that if it's to the point where it's going to a public hearing, that application better be complete and everything should have been worked through before it's a public hearing. So my thought on this is that the only, I agree with Councilmember McConaughey that if there's a weather issue or there's some extraordinary circumstance that the whole council meeting or something's being canceled, that that we do that. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure that I like any exceptions to this policy that, like he said, at the last minute, somebody can say, oh, developer doesn't want to be here and council chair and vice chair can pull it. No, that's not fair to the public. The idea of this process was to say, applications complete far enough to go to a public hearing and you don't want to do it, we're still going to hold it. Whether you're there or not, we're still going to hold it unless you withdraw. I mean, the second part of that B where it says, unless the applicant's withdrawn the application, but okay. And I think there's too much verbiage in B. So that's my thought.
Mr. Murray, what if we took that out? What would that change? If we just took B out?
Yeah, I mean, you could certainly do that. That would still work. Sounds to me like you would like to change the verbiage in subsection A though as well, right? Is that the consensus of the council? To make it so that maybe there's some limitation on the ability to change a date, and maybe adding a different subsection B that the council on its own motion, or in the case of the planning commission on its own motion can initiate a change, right?
Councilmember McConaughey, was there an issue with A or is it just B?
I'm going to throw out a different thought process rather than what's on the paper. My issue isn't so much the specifics that are on here. I want to make sure it's very clear in code that once they've submitted the application, they've paid the fees, and once the agenda's been published, it is no longer, the item no longer belongs to the applicant, rather it belongs to the council, and it's the council's item for the meeting. The applicant does not have a right the day of the meeting to pull it and say, oh, we need to talk about this another day, we're not ready. The applicant, once it's been published, it is the council's item, and the council decides what to do with it, just like every other item. So I don't know that A and B are really necessary, or even that first part. If there could be something given that says, once it's ours, that would keep me happy.
Yeah.
And if I understand you correctly, that by that'd be the full council, right? So it'd be maybe a procedural motion of the full council to make a change from there is what you're recommending.
The same way that we handle any other agenda change after it's been published. Right now, this one's the outlier, because if there are modifications or changes to the agenda after it's been published, I mean, the council office takes care of that, but this is the only one, and this is the only type of item where we've seen somebody outside the council, outside city, impact our meeting and disrupt the flow of our meeting, disrupt the flow of the public voicing their opinion to their elected representatives. I want to make it clear that no, this is ours, just like everything else on the agenda. It follows the same process.
Okay.
So
thank
do
you.
we want to, on 361, after changed, have it be period, and then maybe have a statement that at the discretion of the council, changes may be made or something?
That kind of makes sense to me, but I would also say this should apply to every public hearing, not just public hearings on land use, but any public hearing that we have. Once it's noticed and it's out there, then it's on the agenda unless the council as a whole removes it for whatever reason. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So I have
so-
4 or more for that, Mr. Murray. So if you'll,
And that's just to make sure that the code's consistent, right? If there's another section of code about public hearing where public hearings are referenced and changing public hearing dates is referenced, then we got to make sure we catch that.
Got it.
are we clear on that? Good. Do any other council members have lines on this code? Otherwise, I want to try to move on soon.
I do have one question. And I couldn't find it in the lines. Mr. Anderson, you talked about where the city departments may provide input. I have a concern with I have a concern with that. I think that what the departments need to do is that they have to provide input on the development. Now, it might be something simple like this doesn't affect it's like if Derek Maxfield had to do something, he says, this particular development doesn't affect the West Jordan Fire Department. It's well within our 4-minute service area. Maybe that's enough. But what we've done in the past is we've not included other departments. And my question is leaving it a may, does that leave too much? I don't have to do it, so I'm not going to do it, and we don't get the information that we need. That's the question that I've got.
How I would answer your question, Councilmember Green, is on 175, it does use the word shall be submitted a written petition shall be submitted, which includes the following information. 177 is a written statement explaining how the required criteria in 137C6 are met. And number 2 on line 179 says an analysis of the potential impacts of the proposed amendment on existing infrastructure and public services such as traffic, streets, intersection, water, sewer, storm drain, electrical power, fire protection, garbage collection as determined by, and it used to say city planner, and now it says appropriate city departments and as required by the city code. There's not a may in there. That this is, instead of the city planner and city engineer coming up with traffic, streets, intersection, water, and sewer, it's now the department. So it'd be public utilities that would talk about water and sewer. It would be fire talking about fire. It would be public works talking about streets. It wouldn't be just the city engineer.
Right, but it said the way this says that it says an analysis will be done as determined by the appropriate city department. What if the city department says I'm not going to do it? That's my question is what happens is every city department on board on this, that when there is a development that addresses these, that they have to that they need to put something in the packet, and it might add a couple of weeks to the packet. Are we okay with that? And do the departments understand that even though it says as determined by the appropriate department, that what we're really saying is the departments the departments have to do this to give us a valid analysis, and that this isn't, well, I didn't want to do it this time, so I'm not going to do it. You know where I'm going?
I understand what you're saying, and how I'm reading this is the appropriate city department. So water, sewer, and storm drains, the appropriate city department is public utilities. Fire protection, the appropriate city department is the fire department. Garbage collection is the appropriate city department would be public works. That I'm not an attorney, but that's how I'm reading it. To me, this would require the appropriate city departments to supply an analysis of the project's impact on the city as it relates to adequate public facilities, which is streets, lights, fire, water, sewer, etc.
Mr. Lee, did you have something?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Councilman Green, my experience has been that department heads, if they're impacted by a proposal, they're anxious to provide that analysis or that feedback, that report. I've never seen a department kind of that is impacted and then want to withhold their input. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. They're frustrated if they feel like they may have gotten missed. So they're quite anxious to weigh in, because then they have to deal with the downstream consequences of anything that does get approved.
I just want to make sure that all the departments are on board with this, and that community development's on board with this, that we are going to farm that analysis out, and that those things mentioned in this section um, need to be included in the report. And if they're not, the report's not complete and needs to be addressed.
I think what we can do is we can let this go, and if it doesn't work, then we can bring it back and say we need to make it more specific. Can we do that? Mr. Green, are you okay with that? Councilman Green.
Oh, I can probably live with that.
Okay, thank you. All right, Councilmember Jacob.
Yeah, the only thing that's changing this is already, so white, not yellow, is already existing code.
Correct.
All we're saying is who gets to make the call that needs to be done, taking it away from the city planner or city engineer and giving it to the department heads. We're not asking anybody to do anything different. We're not asking anybody to do an analysis that they didn't already have to do. So it's already in there. We're not. I mean, I don't know. I don't know, Corbin. Maybe you can answer this. I don't know if something's written in code that a department has to do something. There's not really any leeway for them not to do it, right? You can't just say I don't want it and not do it.
Yeah, Councilmember McConaughey used the phrase earlier, legislating yourself into a corner. Sometimes that's my concern, is the code has a lot of shalls, and then it requires us to stop and do that exact thing. Most of the time it was desired, but sometimes we do legislate ourselves into a corner, or legislate a process that then later becomes overly restrictive.
Right. But in those cases where it is in code, where it does say, the mayor or the city administrator shall deliver a budget to the council by X date or whatever, not doing it is not an option.
We don't have a choice. That's right.
Right.
We have to follow the city code.
Okay.
Yep.
Perfect.
Right, is there anything else on this? Otherwise, we'll move on. Seeing no lights, we will move on to oh, Kelvin, your hand's still up. Did you have something more on this one? Okay, let's move on. Discussion of landlord tenant agreement for city utilities. This is brought by Councilmember McConaughey and Councilmember Pack. Go ahead, gentlemen.
Okay, really just wanted to see if there's an appetite from the council to look into setting up a landlord agreement for city utilities. We put most of the high level information or the thought process into the request for council action, but the idea is it gives the city a way to engage directly with the folks that they'll be serving. If there's a utility bill, should the tenant be able to request a second garbage can that they'll be paying for? Or right now it's kind of messy, because if they want a second garbage can, it's got to go to their landlord. The landlord's got to make the request, and the landlord's got to collect. We don't really have a good connection with those who are renting. So other municipalities have set up a landlord agreement, and wanted to see if there's the interest from the council and look into what that would take. Councilmember Pack, did you have anything to add?
Thank you. Yes, definitely agreed that when there isn't an engagement opportunity, then that's where I feel that there's the disconnect, and there can be the negative comments about renters, and I wonder if that's because that there's not that engagement. And quite often there are property managers that take care of issues, and then that adds another layer of complexity to being able to communicate well. You've got the owner, you've got the property manager, got the renter, got the city. So I understand that there's pros and cons either way, but in conversation with quite a few tenants and quite a few landlords, there's that question of, well, why are all utilities except the city utilities in the tenant's name, not the owner's name? And interestingly enough, some of the tenants would actually prefer it to be in their name. It helps for a variety of reasons, whether it be building credit or being able to be in control of their own finances. And certainly as a property owner, that can add another level of complexity where you're responsible for someone else's bill for a service that you're not using, that's being incurred at an entirely different location. So, thank you for asking. I feel that would help some relations and reaching out with all of the entities that I just mentioned, whether it be city, tenant, owner, property manager. Thank you.
I have a question on the packet. When I look at Provo's, I don't know what they call it, Provo Customer Service, Provo City Utilities Landlord Agreement. When I look at this, I read it as that as the property owner, I'm signing off and saying, yeah, you can put it in their name, but if they don't pay, I'm going to pay. I just wonder if I owned a property, I don't know how I'd feel about that. So is that what you're proposing, is having a document like this that basically says the bill can go to them, can be in their name, but if they don't pay, then I'm going to pay?
Which I
is
think
that the
happens
proposal?
anyways. If the renter doesn't pay, they're responsible anyway. So it's already happening. So I think it's just making, because the city doesn't have the funds to go after creditors or go after people who don't pay, it's to help alleviate that cost offset is what I'm assuming from that.
Okay.
One of the potential frustrations from the city perspective is if you have a lot of tenants going through there pretty quick, they rack up a bill, they don't pay it. Who's an incumbent on to pay that? Do we have to go track down each one of the renters? That can become expensive for the city. So what Provo's done is said, if something happens and they don't pay it, landlord, that's your problem. The city doesn't want to incur an expense because of somebody that, without our approval, you offered housing to and you entered into a contract, and we're kind of getting shafted because you didn't screen well. So the landlord still has to make sure that the bill's getting paid. However, the tenant has the ability to put that in their name. It can help them build credit. There are housing assistance programs like folks who are in Section 8 who may have one allowance for rent and a separate allowance for utilities, where everything's lumped together. It makes it very, very difficult for those receiving that assistance to get all of that if they don't have the ability to put it in their name. But yeah, what Provo did is one option, and I'm sure as a landlord you would prefer to let the city kind of take the brunt of tracking down whoever owns it. But there's a number of different ways to do it. Really, the overarching idea is providing an ability for the utilities to be in the name of the person who's living there, so they can engage directly with those who are providing the service. They can determine how many garbage cans they want. They can call and request a missed pickup. They can they don't have to be if a landlord decides to stop paying the water bill, you don't necessarily have the tenant losing water for something that they had been paying all along, and it alleviates some potential problems, but it does potentially involve others. So that's why, before spending much staff time, wanted to find out, is this a direction
If
we'd
we
like to have
have.
further conversation and get staff input before we do anything?
This is a may, not a shall, right? This is allowing, not a directing landlords and tenants to enter into this agreement, not
Correct.
landlord, tenants, and city to enter into this agreement. Okay. I'm fully in favor then, if it's a may. Yep.
Melissa, what I'm trying to ascertain here is if you're in favor of asking staff to look at this and bring us back costs, what it means, what it looks like, how we administer it. If it means you're hiring more people to do it, that's what we're asking. Are you okay?
Yeah, I am absolutely. As someone who's been a homeowner and now currently renting, it's a bit humbling, and I would love to have utilities in my own name.
So we have 4 more. I do have a question that I want brought back the answer to. And my question will be, because I feel like this is partly, well, what was expressed is partly so that then they could get their own dumpsters, right? So if we do this, and what Provo's application and these that I've read, it basically says then the homeowner's responsible. But if, Mr. Wall, if we allow a renter to say, yeah, bring that dumpster that once we load it weighs a ton or 2 on my driveway, that's not really my driveway, and my driveway cracks, is there city liability? All want to know a lot of that.
Yeah, I've looked at that and yes, there is. The real key is whatever you decide to do, whether you allow the tenant to have their name on the bill or not, there needs to be, my recommendation is that you have a home harmless and indemnification agreement from the landlord that says if the tenant doesn't pay, the landlord does. And that doesn't really affect whether you put the landlord's name, the tenant's name on it or not. It always needs to have the property owner on as the underlying guarantor.
Okay.
And there's no reason why you couldn't put the tenant's name on the bill, as long as there's that separate agreement in place.
Okay.
Yeah,
And that's looks like what Provo does.
The
Right.
the cities that I'm aware of that do this, they always require the landlord to sign off on whatever the program is.
Okay. Mr. Lee, do you have any questions for Councilmember Packer or McConaughey?
Right now,
About,
you're just deciding if you want to study this further and bring it back.
and we have said, yes, we do.
So you've decided that. So we have more information and more feedback. We'd like to schedule that to come back in a further work session.
If you will work with Mr. Anderson, that would be great. Anything further, Councilmember Packer or McConaughey?
Yeah, well, I was going to avoid some of the nuances that we see in some of the others, but while you're at it, Provo, if you dive into not just the form, but the agreement, they've got a fun little thing in there that says if you're a landlord and you live more than, I think it's 40 miles away from the property, you're also required to have a property manager that can be reached to help out with issues. So it does help benefit tenants, and where we've heard frustrations with upkeep, it's another tool to give us another tool to help create the environment that we're hoping to see. So there's a lot of benefits, but thank you.
I'm sure some property managers are good. The ones I've had experience with, not so much. Councilmember Pack.
Thank you. And just to add another area there, just so that we can discuss it when it does come back, it is somewhat of a prolific issue on dual billing, where if the owner is receiving the bill and the property owner doesn't realize that it's not getting paid, there are renters who wake up one day and have their water turned off, and vice versa. Sometimes if the bill's just going to the service address, which still does occur, the owner isn't aware that all of a sudden a huge bill is getting racked up, and it could be a leak, it could just be excessive use, and then all of a sudden they're contacted with an egregious sum of money to pay. The other issue is we should probably be aware of the the annexed portion of West Jordan that was originally Kearns. They're just receiving a bill every 3 months because there's Kearns Water District water, but the sewer and garbage is being collected by West Jordan. And if you're only getting a bill once every 3 months, it's easy to let that lapse 3, 6, 9, 12 months. So we do have the good landlord program, and we're saying that there still needs to be good coordination between property manager, owner, tenant. It's just I feel that this really would allow better credit and or better self-sufficiency, feeling like, okay, I'm in charge of my finances. The only thing I'm doing is paying rent, where really, even if you are a homeowner, don't pay your mortgage and you'll see who really owns the home, that'd be the bank. But I think all in all, that would help with all of these areas. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, so if you'll work with Mr. Anderson, that will be great. The last item on our agenda is, again, the discussion about adjusting the tree clearance height, and this was brought forward by Councilmember Bloom and Councilmember Worthen. Who wants to lead, ladies?
Go for it. As you guys know, we had a constituent that came concerned about how high the requirement is to prune trees, and she's asked that we bring it down a foot. And from my conversations with staff and others, it doesn't seem to be that big of a deal, and they're okay with it. I unfortunately missed our last work session on it, so I wanted to get feedback from anybody if they
have an issue with doing that? Are we good with the 14? Anybody have any objections?
I'm
I know we discussed this-
collaborating with
yeah.
Councilmember Bloom because it's like, I know we did this. I think I read my statement. I just can't remember where we landed. Mr. Anderson, do you remember where we landed?
Yes, where we landed is, it felt like there was a consensus to go to 14 feet. You remember our urban forester had mentioned about the tree height varies depending on whether it's with leaf or has snow on it, the flowering pears. The primary thing for tonight is just to make sure we have consensus on the tree height, whether keeping it at 15 or 14. And then the second one, I've got some snippets of code that is that I've got, and there is not conflict, but they describe the measurement two different ways. And I think it would be beneficial to find out from the council how you would want to have that measured for the 14 or 15 feet.
Okay, let me get a consensus on height, and then we'll go on to the number 2. If you are in favor of going to 14, will you give me some kind of indication? 1, 2, 3. I have 4.
Okay.
Councilmember Worthing, Councilmember Whitelock, Councilmember Bloom, and Councilmember Pack. And is your hand up because it's consensus, Councilmember Green, or you okay with 14?
I actually went like this and raised my hand, so yes.
Okay, so I have 5. Councilmember McConaughey.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to say I'm in opposition to 14 because Utah Department of Transportation allows commercial vehicles to operate up to 14 feet. So because state law allows for vehicles to be 14 feet, that allows 0 clearance. That's why I'm okay and prefer the 15. So I recognize I'm in the minority. I just want to state that that's my rationale.
Okay.
And then the second thing, so we'll work on that. The second thing in 13, there's 2 sections.
Hang on.
Oh, sorry.
Councilmember Pack, do you have something?
Oh, thank you. Well, I do, but I can hold on to that for.
Until it. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Anderson. Oh, wait.
Okay, admittedly, I missed the first time we talked about this one as well, and I don't get it.
Okay, well, in a synopsis, a couple years ago, Urban Forester came in, had us change it to 15. We've had a couple of issues this summer. One lady came to council and talked about her trees, and she's had them forever. And
so
we
my ladder
cited
reaches
her.
to 14 feet, but not to 15 feet. I mean,
No, it just if you're cutting, the more you're cutting a tree, if you're cutting more off of your tree, then you're damaging it more because a tree can only sustain so much cutting.
right.
So she's like, can we just do it to 14? And so this is to respond to a resident, actually.
Okay.
So,
I would, yeah, I was gonna say I would love to see the research that says that 14 feet is safe for a tree and 15 feet is not safe for a tree.
it's not the safety of the tree. It's how far up they have to cut the trees for the vehicles. And we had data that showed us that none of our vehicles have been damaged. Most of them, the damage occurs less than 10 feet. And the damage is not very high amount. It's been mainly
so
cosmetic.
She's more concerned with how vehicles impact the tree.
Her concern is her trees. Our urban forester's concern is keeping them up high enough so that vehicles don't get damaged.
Right.
And what the data showed us, that's not
Are there a
happening.
whole lot of vehicles that are 14 feet and 2 inches and not 13 feet and 10 inches? I mean,
It's all in the packet,
tires
actually. It's all there, so you can open it up and look.
I don't understand the impetus for the discussion. To me, it's like saying, well, should the starting point guard be 6'1" or 6'2"? It's like,
I get it,
the ball
but we're
game.
responding to a resident. Councilmember Bloom? No? Okay. Mr. Anderson?
Yes, there are 2 sections of code that deal with tree height. Where the inconsistency is, I've highlighted in yellow. So in 13.13.10G, it talks about tree canopies that extend over streets shall be pruned to provide canopy clearance of at least 15 feet. And then it measures as street pavement and travel lanes and parking lanes. Parking lanes in residential, I presume that is the side near the gutter where you would park your vehicles, and travel lane would be in the center of those. The other code is 131810 E2, and on E2 it just says 15 feet above the street surface. And at the last meeting that I know some of you missed, our urban forester in Katai indicated that the measurement is taken at the interface between the cement gutter and the asphalt pavement. That seam is where the measurement's taken. So my question to you is, how do you want to determine that measurement, and let's apply that to both sections of code so there's a consistency. And I would look for objective parameters as you've been talking about tonight.
And I was hoping that Ty would be here to give us input on that. Councilmember Worthen, do you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, that's, okay, I was gonna say, maybe
Oh,
we
is
could.
Mr. Astle got the info? Excellent.
Okay, so the standard for measuring is just off of the curb where the asphalt is at. That's where they put the measuring stick. I think I know the reason why there's some different references is because there used to be a difference of where cars could park on the street, whether you measured on the outside of the car or the inside of the car. That's why there's some variances in the verbiage over time. But when the change was done a few years ago to 15 feet, that the intent is to measure from where the asphalt and the curb meet, and then on the sidewalk to ensure the 8-foot clearance for people to walk on the sidewalk.
Okay. Are we okay with them measuring as described where the asphalt and the concrete meet on the curb and then going up their 15 feet?
No.
How many are in favor of that? I have one against. Are you in favor?
I believe we should go by the standard from the experts. So yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, Mr. Pat, yes. Okay, I'm gonna go first to Councilmember Jacob and then Councilmember McConaughey.
So a tree just has to be 15 feet clearance from the part where there's not gonna be cars actually interfacing with it at all, but then it can hang down over the street. I mean, says me, like, what if you have a weeping willow in the center, it's planted into the parking strip? And maybe that's not an allowed tree, so whatever, that'd be a bad example, but it's 15 feet there, but 6 feet out into the road, it's touching the ground.
And this is
That's
where,
okay.
when the last discussion we were talking about how some of these newer developments had these trees planted that shouldn't have been planted. So it's things that we need to go look into code to make sure these new developments are planting the appropriate trees, so we're not running into these type of issues.
So my standard would be, you have a 15-foot rope, you hang that from anywhere in the tree, it should not touch the street.
Sorry. So the standard measurement point is where the
14,
curb and the
sorry,
asphalt meet. But if we get a complaint that a tree is hitting something or that it doesn't meet the height, we will measure from another point. But the height is from the curb because the road can increase up to, 14 inches from center to side.
Right.
So we measure from the side. So if we measure out there and it's 14 feet out there, then it's actually
Yeah, the
below
tree,
that 5 foot.
right, if
the
you're 14
15
feet above the road and the road goes like this, your 14 feet mark goes like that too.
Right.
I mean,
But we,
right?
basically, when we bring in a contractor, if we're redoing a road, we bring a contractor in and they take a stick down the side of the road where I described, where the asphalt and it meets, and they go all the way down that, anywhere that stick hits, that branch gets cut off. And if there's a branch that's hanging over lower in the center, that would get cut at that same height.
Right, but only.
But the main measurement point is on the side of the road.
So what I'm saying is, if you're gonna do it a different way than just measuring down the seam and cutting the branches that the 15-foot pole hits or 14-foot pole hits on that seam, and you're not paying attention to the rest of the road, you're meeting the code. If that's all the code says you have to do, then that's all you have to do. And if the truck's hitting the branches because the branches are lower in the middle of the street, then the truck can hit the branches, and you have the same. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it should be above. I mean, it should be, if you drive a 15-foot truck down the road or a 14-foot truck down the road, you don't hit any branches. That's your measure. No, maybe.
But we have to have a standard point for code to go out and measure, right? And
Anywhere that the
some
tree
trees,
is over the road is a standard point. I mean,
no, because then you're gonna have
I
some
don't
ambiguity.
see, I don't see how this does not make sense, but whatever. Okay.
Zach, I totally understand what you're saying. As far as when you're asking what is our standard, that is the standard we do. But that's what's in writing versus, I mean, we look at a holistic approach. You guys know Ty. I mean, he's the living epitome of the Dr. Seuss Lorax. He loves trees. He looks at the whole tree. He measures it. If there's a complaint that there's a height issue, we measure from the side, but if that stick is there and there's something that impedes below that, farther out, that does get cut.
So what about the 8-foot sidewalk? Do we measure the whole width of the sidewalk, any point on the sidewalk, or do we measure from a specific point on the sidewalk?
We usually go from the inside of the sidewalk, but they look at the whole thing. I mean, if they're going down and you can see it's gonna hit somewhere,
I mean,
They address those.
so there's a tree in the sidewalk in my HOA, so I don't know if this even does anything on HOA sidewalks, but there's a tree that I always have to duck under when I'm walking my dogs, because I'm gonna get poked in the eye if I don't.
Yeah.
Now, from the inside of the sidewalk, it's 8 feet off the ground, but the tree goes out and the branch hangs down. And if you're measuring from a certain spot, and that's the only thing you're measuring, and then you say, well, yeah, but Ty does it this way. Great. Ty's not always going to be our forester.
Right.
So I'm not writing the code for a particular person. I'm writing the code for what works. Right. So anyway.
So I have more than four for the 15 feet and for the 14 feet, thank you, for the 14 feet. And I also believe I had my Councilmember Worthen, Councilmember Whitelock, Councilmember Bloom, and Councilmember Back were okay with the measuring. Councilmember McConaughey, were you okay with that, or?
Yeah, I'm okay with it, but I am
Okay.
somewhat in agreement with Councilmember Jacob and wouldn't mind seeing some verbiage that says, starting at the point where the concrete meets the asphalt and continuing horizontally over the road, it shall be something like that to indicate it's not just one particular point, but that's the starting point. But when they take the measurement, they start there.
I wanted to say something last time, and I apologize I didn't get up and say it, but we will make whatever you as a whole believe is right, and we'll do it however you want. The only thing that I would caution is that there are areas of trees that we are responsible for. Anywhere that it's not on the frontage of a home, it's the city's responsibility, and anything that we change
So
that affects
good news,
that.
those can still be 15 feet if you'd like.
When it comes to the others, though, there are stances from other cities that, you send out a notification, hey, you're non-compliant to our code. There are other organizations or cities or municipalities that give you a time frame to have that done, and rather than imposing a large fine, the city says you've got 14 days to do this, otherwise we're going to come do it our way and you won't be happy about it. That is something to think about, and I may be overstepping my bounds here, but the only thing that would affect is staff and budget to do something like that, but there are other options that I would mention.
I appreciate that input. Councilmember Pack, and then Councilmember McConaughey, and then Councilmember Green. And I just want to point out it's 6:43.
Thank you. I'll strive to be brief. I want to recognize, as I mentioned last time, it's challenging for a lot of residents, myself included, who planted trees 25 years ago to try to get up and prune them, whether it's 14 or 15 feet. But also just wanting to see if there's a desire to be more comprehensive in this, not just the height on one side. Last meeting I mentioned, well, what about, as it mentions on the last page of our packet here, some other cities have a 7-foot clearance on the sidewalk. Do we want to stay with 8? Similar to Councilmember Jacob, as I'm walking through my neighborhood or on my phone or looking elsewhere, I kind of get poked in the head sometimes.
Weird, I never have those issues.
But then also there's the issue of how much do we need to prune them back for sign visibility? And I know we already have some code here, 13-13-10 for power lines, but also I mentioned my friend who's a mail carrier who says, hey Dave, you got to prune in. I can't get to your mailbox. And maybe we want to look at trees that are approved for park strips. It was mentioned last meeting, we love flowering pear and flowering plum, but but they can be very challenging. And is this 14 feet with the blossoms and with snow on it, or without? Because we know that it's already going to be getting lower certain times of the year in the spring and winter, like tomorrow morning probably. And also be noticing from code enforcement. We've talked about how can we have a balance of making it be poignant so people take attention, but also respectful, so that it doesn't seem like the city isn't understanding to certain people's plight of, well, how am I gonna, I can't prune that right now, or I can't, what was the other example that was mentioned? There was a code violation for, hey, your drainage has overflown, out the sewer drain. Well, how do you expect me to fix that in the middle of winter when it's frozen over? Can I get some time to do that? So I'm just wondering if this is comprehensive enough. We're talking about one side of the tree, but what about the other side? And what about some other factors there? Thank you.
Councilmember McConaughey.
Just to add an opportunity to make things a little bit messier, I would also not be opposed to a modification when it comes to code enforcement and trying to remedy the issue. If they're given the ability to provide like a pruning schedule and a pruning plan, because you don't want to do too much too fast. If it's something that's not deemed urgent or something like that. I don't know if this would even be the case, but if you've got something that, oh, you know what, it's going to take 18 to 24 months to fully fix this, but the parts that need to be fixed aren't really causing much of a danger. I know that could cause issues with staff, but I wanted to throw out the idea that when it comes to enforcement, I personally wouldn't be opposed to having some sort of prolonged remedy period to help ensure the health of the trees, rather than people just getting frustrated and saying, you know what, bag it, I'm just going to pull the whole thing out.
Yeah.
Don't want that.
I like that thought. Mr. Wall.
Just Councilmember McConaughey, to his comment, I don't know of anything in our code that would preclude code enforcement from treating these code violations any different than they do others. And they go through a notice of violation process, and it's typically, depending on the severity of the violation, it could be up to 2 or 3 months that they give the person a chance to remedy it before they actually take action, unless there's a public safety hazard. And if you wanted to codify that here, I guess you could, but I don't know that the law doesn't preclude code enforcement from doing that, treating this like they do any other code violation.
So I'm curious for either you or Mr. Quayle, because I understand what Councilmember Jacob is saying, but I also know that it needs to be pretty clear and precise where we're measuring. So sure, that tree at that point might be 15 and a branch higher might be up and down. But if we say that you can just go on out however you want, measure out there because there's that branch, what does that do to us legally?
Well,
Mr.
I think
Roll?
it puts our staff in a tough spot, because if they measure anywhere other than what the code specifically says, then the argument can be made that they're exercising administrative authority beyond what you have given them.
Okay.
And so, to Councilmember Jacob's point, you probably ought to let the staff work on some sort of language that allows for the measurement vertically from any point of the pavement over which the tree hangs. I didn't say that as artfully as I could if I was writing it, but that would be the concept.
All right, council, is anyone opposed to that? I don't see any opposed, so please add that to your work. Did you want any more work? I can keep going. Mr. Lee, do you have something? And of course, I'm sure we all, if you don't want code to agree throughout code, let me know.
Oh,
Yeah, we all
can you
want
go
it
back
to
a
agree.
slide? Sorry, Rob summarized what I was going to say earlier. I feel like to address Councilman Jacob's concerns and the staff concern, if we use the language in 13.13.10 here and said 14 feet above any portion of street pavement in travel lanes or parking lanes, our standard is to measure at that seam, but if it hangs down anywhere over a travel lane or a parking lane, it's in violation. It seems that's the intent, and if we can just bring that back to you in a business item or
Okay.
public hearing, because
I
it's land use.
I see
Public hearing,
Councilmember
'cause it's
Green
land
still
use.
has his
Okay.
hand up. Councilmember Green, we have like 4 minutes.
I'll shut up and we'll deal with it later.
Okay. All right, then we are going to call this meeting adjourned and Do I need a motion for this one? Yes, I do.
Move to
Motion by
adjourn.
Councilmember McConaughey, a second by Councilmember Bloom. All in favor? Any opposed?
Aye.
Passes.